In my last podcast, we looked at autism and intelligence and why intelligence is not a reliable predictor of support needs. As part of that discussion, we also talked about the normal distribution curve as it relates to intelligence. This time, I want to extend the concept of the normal distribution curve and look at how it relates to many aspects of autism and why autism is a life lived at the extremes. Hi, I'm Phil, a late diagnosed autistic older adult, and it's my goal to advocate for autistic adults by providing positive science-based information about autism and by sharing some of my own experiences along the way. So let's take a bit of a look at autism through the lens of statistics, and a warning at this point that I failed statistics at university. When we think of autistic traits and experiences, what we often find is that autism is either too much or too little of any one thing. In fact, some people might say that autism is a bit of a fraud because some autistic people are at one extreme with certain skills and others are at the other extreme. Let's take literacy, for example, in small children. Some autistic children will be very slow to speak or learn to read compared to the norm, whereas other autistic children will be the opposite and learn to speak or read much earlier than the norm. So how can that be? Surely it's either one or the other. Saying it's both, well, isn't that hedging your bets or keeping the options open? Does that make this whole autism thing a bit of a fake condition? As we spoke about last time in relation to intelligence, when we look at any population from a statistical perspective, we often discover that there is a common way that individuals within the wider population are ordered. We refer to this as a normal distribution curve, where the bulk of the population shares similarities with each other, which is represented as a bell shape in the middle of the curve. As we move closer to the edges of the curve, what we find is the relative number of individuals falls away sharply, leaving a long tail of outliers in both directions. This may be fairly obvious when thinking about something like intelligence, but in reality this representation could also be used when thinking about any human trait or experience. If we think about the example given earlier of literacy in children, what we find is that most children fit under the tallest part or bowl of the curve. These children would have what might be considered a normal range of literacy. If we move down the curve, we might look at children who experience reading or literacy difficulties, and as we move away further from the centre part of the curve, these difficulties might become severe enough to be classified as dyslexia. And likewise, as we move away from the centre or mean of the curve in the opposite direction, we might encounter children who are extremely advanced in their reading or literacy compared to the other children of their age. And these children might be considered to be hyperlexic. The important point to note from a population dynamics point of view is the further we move away from the average or mean, the less people fit under that part of the curve. So what we so often find with autistic people, both children and adults, is that these edges or extremes is where the bulk of our experiences fit. To look at this in more depth, let's have a think about how the brains of autistic people are different from the wider population. When scientists have studied the autistic brain, they identified that it makes neural connections differently to allistic or non-autistic brains. Specifically, autistic brains make either way more neural connections or way less to any given stimulus or input. But how that plays out in the actual traits of the autistic person is less predictable. The reason for this is that neurons are tiny and it takes a great many neural connections to form the external traits that we can observe. There are so many individual connections being made in the brain, and all of those connections play a part in the overall outcome. It may only take a small variation in these connections to mean that one autistic person has a strong language ability, for instance, and a different autistic person has a limited language ability. Added to this is the fact there is not just one part of the brain that creates the autistic traits or another that creates the ADHD traits, for instance. The reality is much more complex. It's the combination of all the connections that make subtle influences on the skills, abilities, influences, or challenges of each person. And it's this combination of attributes that may mean a person is autistic or ADHD or dyslexic, a genius or intellectually disabled, or even neurotypical. As no two people will ever have exactly the same neural connections, no two people will ever have exactly the same combination of traits or attributes. So just as we say no two autistic people are the same, we could also say no two people are the same, which at a macroscopic level is pretty obvious. So how does all this relate back to the population curve we discussed earlier? Well, when it comes to autistic people, what we discover is that these different combination of neural connections make autistic people sit at the outside edges of the population distribution curve for many attributes of human experience. So autistic people, for example, might be highly literate or have low levels of literacy, be sensitive to loud noises or seek loud noises, be sensitive to pain or under-responsive to pain, have aphantasia, a lack of visual imagery, or hyperphantasia, hyperreal visual imagery, be hypersensitive to taste and need to eat very plain food, or be undersensitive to taste and crave food with strong flavours. Either may like spinning around to seek vestibular input, or get car or motion sickness, which is a high sensitivity to vestibular input. Make no eye contact or make too much eye contact. This list could go on, but you get the gist. And it might also be that the autistic person exhibits both ends of the scale of any of these traits at different times. Okay, you might say, I get that autistic brains are structurally different, but how is it that it always means that they are at the extremes or have different abilities? Well, a couple of points to note here. Autistic people have many differences to holistic people, but an important point to add is that there are many, many more traits and abilities that are completely consistent with non-autistic people. First and foremost, autistic people are, well, people. We're not a different species, so that means that our biology is more the same than different. So when we come back to talking about the differences, what we see is that these differences are actually small but significant. For example, I can go out and socialise with other people. That's a similarity. But I will have to plan, script, and have an exit strategy. Then later I might be whacked out from fatigue. That's a difference. From the outside, others may only see the similarity in that I was at the social gathering like everyone else. They don't see the differences and the subsequent implications. So what we come back to is autism is a difference, and how we describe difference is through statistics. And when it comes to groups, be it people, animals, or objects, that is represented through a population curve, as we've already said. And difference is found at the edges of that curve. So we have talked about difference and how that relates to the population distribution curve. The one slight exception here that is important to talk about is intelligence or IQ. Now, this is an area we are much more familiar in talking about population distribution. In the case of IQ, intelligence quotient, there is a standard population distribution curve, and that curve shows that the average or mean intelligence figure is set arbitrarily at a score of 100. This means that half the population have an IQ score greater than 100 and half have a score less than 100. When we look at the population curve, what we see is that the bell of the curve is centred around the mean of 100. Then it falls off in both directions. Scores of between 85 and 115 are considered normal IQ. If we travel to the left end of the curve, we find people who have low IQ, or what's known as intellectual disability. And likewise, if we travel to the right end of the curve, we find people who have high IQ. And even further to the right, we find geniuses. Moving even further right, we find transformative geniuses and polymaths, people like Einstein, Newton, Da Vinci, Beethoven and Shakespeare. So, does autism also follow this pattern mentioned earlier of sitting at the edges of the population curve of intelligence? Well, here it gets a little complicated, so I want to take a breath before answering that question. The first thing to note is that autistic people can and do cover the entire intelligence spectrum. So yes, there are autistic people with intellectual disabilities, and there are autistic geniuses and even polymaths. So let's, at this point, wipe away the stereotypes of autistic people being one or the other. Autistic people can and do have the full range of possibilities of IQ. But, and this is where it gets a bit confusing, it seems that the population curve of autistic intelligence may not strictly follow the normal distribution curve that is present in the rest of the population. So yes, there is a higher probability that an autistic person may be closer to one end of the spectrum or other than non-autistic people. But the reasons for this are a little harder to pin down. It may be that these results have more to do with inadequacies of testing rather than be the full picture. For instance, an autistic person with average IQ may fit in better and mask more easily than an autistic person with either high IQ or low IQ. So they may not ever be identified as autistic, skewing the IQ statistics away from the centre. Likewise, IQ tests are designed for measuring white, neurotypical, middle-class people. Autistic brains are different, so may also test differently. Basically, we know there is an uneven IQ profile for autistic people, but the reasons are yet to be fully explored scientifically. For now, I think the most accurate statement is that autistic people can have IQ scores across the entire range. So what are the key takeaways on this topic? Autistic people often are outliers and sit statistically well away from the average in both directions in any one of a number of traits or abilities. It is never going to be an accurate description if autism is described as too much or too little of any one thing, as it is often the case that one autistic person might be at one extreme and another autistic person might be at the opposite extreme. The commonality here, though, is that the autistic person is more likely to be at the extreme than closer to the middle of any particular autistic trait, or even any human experience in general. And this is where autism as a difference becomes a more adequate description. Whether that is in intelligence, literacy, communication, sensory experiences, or how our bodies and in particular our nervous systems respond to daily life. And as an aside, this difference can also influence our health outcomes, both physical and mental. Okay, so that's it for now. Please jump across to the comment section to join in the conversation about autism at the extremes. What areas have you noticed where you are either too much or too little as an autistic person? And as always, thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye for now.